The harbor had once been loud. There had been a time when cranes swung over the water all day and all night, when chains rang against steel, when engines coughed and roared, and when ship horns cut through the fog. The air had smelled of diesel and hot metal and thick rope soaked in salt. Men shouted to each other from dock to dock, and the old basin inside the breakwater had never been quiet for long. Then the work moved away. Farther along the coast, the city built a new deep port with bright lights, clean piers, and silent modern machines. Big ships went there now. Trucks rolled out along new roads. The old harbor remained behind a cracked breakwater like a forgotten tool left at the bottom of a box. The cranes still stood, but they no longer lifted anything. Paint peeled from their arms in long strips. Rust spread along their legs and joints. The docks were cracked and crooked. The warehouses had broken windows that looked like tired eyes. The water in the inner basin was dark and slow, disturbed only by wind, tide, and a few lazy circles of trash. Only one person still worked there. At night, an old watchman walked the empty docks. He had gray hair and heavy hands, marked by old scrapes and machine oil that never fully washed out. His jacket was thick. His boots were worn smooth in the places where wood and concrete had rubbed them for many years. The company that still owned the harbor kept him on because it was simpler that way. It was easier to pay one man than to deal with broken gates, stolen scrap, or trouble on the abandoned piers. Every night, the watchman made the same round. He checked the padlock on the gate. He walked past the first dock and the leaning warehouse. He crossed the concrete edge of the basin where the dark water lay close under the boards. As he passed the nearest crane, he always rested his fingers for a moment on its cold base, brushing old paint and rust as if greeting a silent coworker. Even in its half-sleep, the harbor still made sounds. Chains tapped gently when the wind tugged on them. Loose sheets of metal clicked and shivered. Old hulls, tied and forgotten along the wall, rubbed and knocked against their fenders when the tide turned. Wooden beams creaked in the docks. The watchman knew each of these sounds. He knew which ones meant nothing and which ones told him that something was slowly coming loose. Most nights, the noise of the modern city stayed far away. He could hear traffic on a distant road and the faint hum from the new port. Sometimes, a siren wailed and faded on the hills behind. All of that sat like a soft blanket of sound above the deeper quiet of the abandoned basin. The first time he heard the wail, he thought the cranes were shifting in a new and worrying way. The tide was high that night. The water inside the basin rose almost to the undersides of the piers. The air was cold and heavy. There was almost no wind. The watchman had just turned toward the middle of the docks when something changed under his feet. A low vibration touched the soles of his boots. At first, it felt like a distant truck rolling over a bridge. Then the vibration thickened and rose through the dock boards into his legs and chest. The sound that followed was not sharp. It did not scrape or rattle. It was deep and smooth, a long-held note that slid gently up and then down again. He stopped walking. The usual harbor noises gathered around him. A chain clicked once. A piece of loose tin knocked 2 times against a wall. A small wave slapped against concrete. Under these sounds, the deep note continued, slow and patient. The watchman walked to the edge of the basin and looked down. The water was almost black. One weak lamp above a warehouse door drew a pale line on its surface, but below that line he could see nothing. Still, The note rose, curved, and fell, and now he could hear that there were several tones braided together. They seemed to move through the pilings and the foundations and the hollow spaces of the port. The sound pressed gently against his ribs. He stood with one hand on a rusted bollard and listened until the note finally thinned and faded away. When silence returned, the harbor's normal creaks felt small and fragile. He finished his round with a strange tightness in his chest and told himself that perhaps some old pump had started up somewhere under the docks. Maybe there was a leak or a broken pipe. He made a mark in his notebook to check the next day, even though he knew that most of the systems that once moved water here had been shut down for a long time. The next night, the sound returned. It came a little earlier. He felt the first vibration in the dock boards not far from the same crane as the night before. This time, when the note rose out of the water, he went straight to the same place on the edge of the basin and leaned over. The deep voice flowed through the concrete and steel. It rose along the piles that held the docks. The cranes answered in a strange way. Their long arms did not move in any obvious pattern, but their joints complained and ticked in time with the slow beat of the sound. A loose chain hanging from a forgotten hook began to sway almost invisibly and clicked against the metal above it at the lowest point of each phrase. The watchman laid his palms on the cold rail that ran along the pier. The sound beneath him was like a long breath drawn through water and stone. Sometimes it held steady. Sometimes it rose in a wide arc and then sank again. Sometimes it broke into smaller notes that chased each other, then joined again into a single strong line. He recognized it now. It was a wail. When he had been a younger man, he had worked on tugboats and small service ships that moved in and out of this and other harbors. Out beyond the breakwater, far in the real open water, he had seen whales a few times, dark backs pushing up through waves, white mist rising from their blows. He had heard recordings of their songs on the radio and in films. Those recordings had sounded distant and clean, separated from him by equipment and voices. This sound did not. It was inside the harbor, inside the dock, inside his own bones. That idea did not make much sense. The basin was not large. The entrances were narrow. A whale was a huge animal, built for open water and deep channels, not for circling under cracked piers and idle cranes. Yet the sound insisted on its presence. It came from straight below, from the middle of the basin, from a depth where the water was thick and cold, but still not deep by ocean standards. On another night, when the sea was less choppy, the watchman saw proof. The water was calm enough to show shapes just below the surface. The song had reached one of its slow, high arcs when a broad, pale form passed near the top of the basin. It moved with a steady, unhurried stroke. For a moment, a large, dark eye appeared just below the skin of the water, glossy in the lamplight. The eye never broke the surface, and neither did any part of the whale's head. But the watchman knew that something large and alive turned in circles under the rotting pilings. The animal did not push against the walls. It did not thrash. It moved with the care of something that understood narrow places. The watchman did not tell anyone. In theory, there were people he could have called. There were numbers on papers pinned to the wall of the small office where he kept a kettle and a worn chair. There were agencies with long names that sent out boats and experts. He imagined trying to explain. There is a whale in the dead harbor. It comes at night. It sings to the rust and the cranes. The water is deep enough, just in the middle. It has not left yet. He imagined the questions that would follow, the forms that would be filled, the long talk of risk and cost and responsibility. He imagined men in clean jackets standing on his dock with clipboards. He imagined the whale frightened by strange noise and busy water. He put the thought away and went back to walking his round. For many nights, the pattern repeated. The whale came only after the city around the harbor had settled into its own kind of sleep. Apartment lights went out on the hillside. The rumble from the new port softened for a while. Only a few street lamps still shone along the road behind the warehouses. When the night reached that thin quiet, the deep note rose again from under the basin. The song never sounded exactly the same, but the harbor slowly learned its shape. As the whale sang, the cranes answered with their slow metal voices. Cables shifted inside them. Hooks turned slightly. Their long arms creaked in a way that matched the rise and fall of the sound. A half-sunk floating dock knocked regularly against the wall, its heavy corner hitting on the same beat each time the song returned to its lowest tone. The harbor seemed to follow the music like a conductor. The watchman stood and listened, and in the beginning he heard mainly his own memories. The long, steady notes pulled up images from his past. He saw again the days when the basin had been packed with ships tied side by side. He saw men in bright jackets walking along the edges of open holds. He heard the grind of winches and the clatter of chains. He smelled the heavy mix of oil, wet rope, fresh paint, and distant fish. The sudden changes in the song brought back later days. He remembered how the work had slowly shrunk, how one berth after another had closed. He remembered meetings and notices and faces that stopped coming to work. He remembered the last big ship to leave the harbor, its horn sounding longer and more often than usual as it pulled away. Night after night, as he listened, something else shifted. The watchman began to hear more than his own life in the song. He heard the voice of the harbor itself. When the whale held a low tone for a long time, pressed deep into the concrete and steel, the watchman heard the weight of all those years when the port had been full. He heard the steady work, the predictable movement of cargo, the simple fact that the place had once mattered to the city. When the tone climbed and then broke, he heard the moment when the harbor had been judged too old, too shallow, too slow. He heard decisions made on paper somewhere inland. He heard the quiet arrival of the last pay packets for many men. When the whale's song fell into slow, careful notes, with long silences between them, he heard the present, when little happened, and yet the docks still stood, waiting for something that would never return. He did not say these thoughts aloud. He barely admitted them to himself. But the deep voice from the basin had changed how he listened. On some nights, he sensed that the whale listened back. He began to speak soft words into the dark while the song moved through the harbor. He didn't speak to the animal as such. He simply told stories to anyone or anything that might be hearing. He told the story of the first crane that had arrived on a flat barge and been lifted into place piece by piece. He spoke of long, freezing mornings when ice had formed on ropes and decks. He remembered the warmth of crowded canteens and the sound of cutlery and jokes. He did not know if the whale understood anything at all. But sometimes, after he spoke, The song changed slightly. A new phrase appeared. An old note repeated in a new way. The cranes groaned differently. A chain tapped a new rhythm. One night, a strong storm came in from the open sea. For most of the year, the breakwater protected the inner basin well, but this storm rode over it. Waves broke hard against the outer wall and then pushed through the narrow entrance in confused high swells. Wind screamed through the gaps in the cranes. Rain hit the dock roofs in sheets. The watchman stayed inside his small office for as long as he could. He sat with his hands around a mug of hot drink and listened to the building shake. Loose panels clattered. Somewhere a window broke with a sharp crack. The whole harbor moaned and rattled as if all its old pains had woken at once. Then the whale began to sing. The voice rose through the storm like a long, steady beam. It did not fight the wind and rain. It simply existed underneath them, deeper and heavier. Each swell of the sea carried the sound into the foundations and the piles. The cranes picked it up and repeated it. Chains snapped tight and then relaxed in time. The half-sunk dock hit the wall with a regular, almost musical beat. The watchman could not stay inside. He pulled on his jacket, opened the door, and pushed himself into the storm. Rain soaked him at once. Wind tried to shove him back. He moved slowly along the dock, holding onto rails and posts when his boots slipped on wet concrete. At the edge of the basin, he stopped. The water heaved and boiled. White foam jumped into the air. Between the waves, when the swell dipped, he saw a wide gray back roll near the surface. A tail fluke rose for a moment, dark against the white water, then vanished again. Each time the whale turned, the song deepened. The watchman felt the sound in his teeth and in the old scars along his fingers. It ran up the legs of the cranes and out along their arms. It climbed the warehouse walls. It hummed in the hollow spaces under the dock. For a moment, the storm and the port and the whale seemed to breathe as one thing. In that rough, wild harmony, the watchman heard the whole life of the harbor all at once. He heard the first pile being driven into the soft seabed. He heard the first small boat tying up to a new quay. He heard workers cheering when the first large ship docked safely. He heard again the slow decline, the last day, the final closing of gates. The storm moved on. By morning, the sea had calmed. Broken branches and trash floated in corners of the basin. Some loose pieces of metal had finally torn free and lay twisted on the concrete. The cranes dripped. The air smelled of salt and wet rust. The whale did not sing that morning. The watchman told himself that this made sense. The animal needed rest after such a night. He cleaned what he could, hung a sheet over the broken window in the office, and went home at the end of his shift with heavy legs. That evening, he came back and walked his round. When he reached the familiar place by the basin, he stopped and listened. The usual sounds were present. Water lapped gently against the wall. A chain lifted and fell once. A bird cried somewhere in the dark. Behind him, far off, the new port hummed with its steady modern rhythm. The whale's song did not come. The next night was the same. On the third night, the watchman leaned on the rusted rail for a very long time, staring into the black surface of the basin. The water showed him the reflection of a thin moon and the faint orange halo of the city. Nothing moved below. He tried to accept what this meant. Perhaps the whale had found its way back to deeper channels. Perhaps the storm had forced it out of the basin when the tide and the waves had reached a certain pattern. Maybe the animal had followed its own distant route, guided by instincts that had nothing to do with abandoned cranes and old men. He wanted to believe that. Even so, the harbor felt louder in its silence than it had before the whale came. The normal creaks and groans had fallen out of the pattern they had shared with the song. The cranes now complained at random. The half-sunk dock knocked when it wanted to, not when some deep note asked it to. The basin sounded disorganized, like people talking all at once in a language no one understood. The watchman realized that he had changed too. Before the whale arrived, he had accepted the harbor as a quiet ruin. It was a place he watched and protected out of habit and duty, nothing more. While the whale sang, the port had felt alive again, not in the way of cranes and cargo, but in a slower way that belonged to time and memory. Now, with the whale gone, he could not return to his old way of listening. As he walked at night, he began to hear fragments of the song inside his own head. When a chain moved in a certain way, he heard it as part of a phrase he remembered. When a crane settled with a long sigh, it sounded to him like the end of a note the whale had once held. Sometimes he hummed under his breath. His voice was rough and low. He could not reach the deep tones the whale had shaped or hold a sound as long. It did not matter. When he tried to follow the melody he carried in his memory, the harbor answered in small ways. A cable ticked. A panel flexed. The wooden beams under the dock gave a soft reply. Nothing magical happened. The whale did not return. The cranes did not lift themselves and begin to work again. But the watchman no longer felt that he walked through a dead place. He understood now that the harbor still held its past. The years of noise and effort were stored in every scar on the concrete, every dent on the dock edge, every smooth, worn patch on the handrails. The whale had forced that truth to the surface for a short time. It had taken a forgotten place and turned it into a kind of instrument, one that could still answer a voice from the deep. Time moved on. Seasons shifted around the bay. Each year more weeds grew between the cracks in the piers. Each year the watchman's steps grew slower. He continued to walk his route. He continued to stop by the basin and listen. On some very still nights, when the sea outside the breakwater lay almost flat and the new port behind the hill went quiet for a short while, he thought he could hear a faint echo from far out beyond the mouth of the bay. It was never loud and never clear. Sometimes it was only a vague, deep pressure in the air or a hint of a tone at the edge of hearing. When that happened, he stood a little straighter and rested both hands on the cold rail. He liked to think that somewhere in the wide, dark water, a whale still carried in its body the memory of a narrow harbor with rusted cranes and empty docks, a harbor that had once answered its call with steel and wood. If anyone had stood by the fence at the edge of the old port on such a night, they might have heard only the usual sighs of an aging industrial place. They might have seen only an old man on a cracked pier, leaning on a bollard, looking down at black water. They would not have known that in his mind, and for a short time in the past, the silent harbor had been full of music, and that the voice of a whale had taught him to hear the slow ending of a city's working life, not as a simple death, but as a deep, strange song.